Thanks very much, Sonia, and welcome everybody. As you'd expect, I have some slides this afternoon, so I'll just pull those up. Mostly as a handrail. I am notorious for talking a lot about cyber. Once you get me started, it is difficult to shut me up. So this deck is really for my benefit to help me try and stick to the time. So this afternoon, we're going to have a look at, in particular, who poses the threat of cybercrime. Who are we at threat from? And we hear and see lots of different stories in the media, but what I'm going to do or aim to do today is to make hackers human. We're talking about a human threat, a threat that comes from a human source. I'm going to bring some of these humans to life this afternoon. We'll look at the main types of cybercrime that these humans are responsible for. I'll then talk through some really interesting data. Actually, as an insurer, we have 60,000 clients globally, ranging from sort of small to medium through to S&P Fortune 500 clients. We get to see an awful lot in our claims data, for example, in terms of the very latest in tactics or trends, what forensics intelligence is telling us. I'm going to share some of that with us today, which hopefully will help position the nature of the threat and what we can do about it. I'll talk a little bit about the main challenges our clients are facing at the moment, because there are trends emerging in that space. Where are we really sort of struggling to combat the threat of cybercrime, and where perhaps we're doing quite well? And then there's an opportunity at the end. Should you wish to ask me anything, please do. If it is burning in your mind as I'm speaking, please just interrupt me as well. I'm very happy to field questions either midterm or at the end. I start most of my sessions with this slide, mostly because this wonderful picture of Albert Einstein cheers me up no end, no matter what time of day or otherwise. You can see he's clearly quite a character, or clearly was quite a character. This is a paraphrase, of course. Education is not the learning of facts, but the training of the mind to think. I think Einstein said this a couple of times, but most notably at a university, which didn't go down terribly well. But the reason I'm raising it today is I don't want to sit here and drown you in facts and figures or information that you could obtain from Google. What I'd like to try and do is encourage you and help you to think about the subject for yourselves, bring to life, in your own imagination and your own thoughts, as opposed to just death by PowerPoint. A little bit about who I am. A very philosophical question for post-lunch webinar, so I'll try and keep it straightforward. I joined Hiscox in September 2019, so I'm coming up to sort of 4 years in my post here. I'm not from insurance originally. It's a sort of fairly new venture for me. I work in what's known as the Cyber Clear Centre at Hiscox. It's a group role, so I'm a group director here at Hiscox. And I lead on our sort of product, the cyber insurance product that we offer across our sort of Lloyd's of London business and our retail business units across the UK, US, and Europe. I also have the great privilege of leading on 2 of our strategic initiatives, educational and advisory. Advisory is working sort of hand in glove with our clients to help them sort of understand and develop risk management strategies for their businesses. Educational side tends to be more internally focused, looking or working within our underwriting community itself. Before Hiscox, I was a consultant for about a decade. So I spent 10 years with Deloitte and KPMG, amongst others, in the consulting spheres, mostly sort of management consulting, jazz hands style consulting, really. Although I do come from a technical background, the sort of 12 years or so before I joined consulting, I worked with British intelligence in a number of different roles, in a number of different theatres, everything from cryptanalytics, so breaking encrypted messages without the key, all the way through to, sort of offensive hacking and social engineering, as we call it today, sort of human intelligence. So a sort of broad set of experiences, obviously none of which were by my design. I didn't set out sort of, in my early 20s with the intention of landing a job 24 years later at Hiscox. That just sort of happened organically. Okay, that's enough about me. The cybercrime business. We're talking about the threat posed from hackers, really, is what we're talking about. And I love Wikipedia. It's a really amazing resource, really is. But I've got to say, this definition isn't one of my most favorites. So if we look at Wikipedia's definition of a hacker, computer hacker is any skilled computer expert that, a bunch of gobbledygook, and then it goes into uses bugs or exploits to break into computer systems. Now, my problem with this definition is the use of the word skilled computer expert. I don't think that accurately defines the threat today. And the use of bugs or exploits, I don't think is particularly meaningful language. So I'm going to talk and expand upon this definition over the course of the next 50 minutes or so. Now, why do I disagree with this? In my experience, well, today I would say literally anyone can be a hacker. Actually, this is really the problem we face, is the barrier to entry to becoming a hacker, getting involved in cybercrime is so low today that it means it's widely available as a career choice for many different individuals. A decade ago, you did really need to be a bit of a code ninja, pretty slick on a keyboard, pretty good with your tech in order to really make any money out of cybercrime. But today, due to the commoditization, the lowering of the bar, the technical bar, or barrier to entry, what it's meant is more and more people have gotten involved in cybercrime who a decade ago wouldn't have been. So when you hear, in the news or vendors talking about, the evolution of the cyber threat, why is the threat going up? That really is one of the main drivers, one of the main reasons. It's just so easy today. I can just buy some tools, download some malicious software, and get myself started as a hacker. So the barrier to entry today is incredibly low. Now, if you're a Daily Mail reader, shame on you. But more seriously, if you are a Daily Mail reader, you'll be very familiar with this image. It is, of course, the image of every hacker that we've ever known and seen, a particularly unhelpful image, I might add. It's obviously intended to elicit fear, uncertainty, and doubt in us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to de-hood some of our hackers for us, our most notorious hackers, bring them to life, tell you a little bit about them, because when we talk about cybercrime, we are talking about the threat from human beings. Now, in cyber, we like to sort of classify or categorize our hackers, mostly by capability and motivation. So they're the two characteristics that we're really looking at when we try to sort of group together different classes of hacker. Now, of course, we use this box model. We try and put human beings in a box, and we say that they're, amateur hackers. They all conform to a set standard. Of course, I'm a realist. I know that isn't true, but it does make it easier to organize how we talk or discuss the cyber content. So when we look at the amateur class, I'm going to give you some sort of stereotypical characteristics here, but just obviously in the back of your mind, think about the human nature. I mean, none of us, whilst there's lots of similarities between people, obviously our sort of imagination, creative flair, our own personal experiences drive much of how we perhaps behave. So our first class, our sort of lowest level of capability, lowest level of motivation, hacking community, the amateur community. Now, sometimes we hear this community referred to as script kiddies, a term that I particularly don't like personally. For one, the script kiddie on the right-hand side of the screen is 50-year-old Glaswegian hacker by the name of Gary McKinnon, who you may have heard of. When we talk about script kiddies, it's a bit pejorative, really, when you're looking at sort of hackers in their 50s. I'm sure Gary McKinnon wouldn't particularly appreciate being referred to as a script kiddie. But in terms of class, the amateur class, oftentimes opportunistic in terms of who they target. So this isn't sort of highly targeted campaigns that they'll be performing. This is opportunistic. They'll have perhaps identified a vulnerability in a particular business, or they've taken it upon themselves to do some scanning of something, and they've just highlighted a particular weakness in an organization. There's nothing sort of directed about it, really. It is purely opportunistic, self-funded, almost exclusively. If you look at Gary McKinnon, he was actually working for the Glasgow Council, so the Glasgow City Council in the IT team. Actually, he was a sort of administrator, systems administrator technical admin. So he was paying for his hacking activities through his salary from Glasgow City Council. We say often technology enthusiasts that usually come from some technical background in the amateur space. Motivation, often reputational. So if I'm in the amateur classes and I want to move up, maybe start getting paid or making some money from my ventures, I'm going to need to have a bit of a reputation, a CV, some sort of, resume of stuff I've hacked in the past to get me into perhaps a sort of group, a hacking group of some sort. They do seek references, so might be looking to build a bit of reputation, ideologically motivated by beliefs. So if we look at Gary McKinnon, for example, if you're not familiar with his case, he hacked NASA many years ago now, actually. Well, not that many, sort of eight-ish years ago, he hacked NASA. He believed that they had developed black energy technology or dark energy technology, the ability, if you're a regular conspiracy theorist and you've got your tinfoil hat on today, you'll be well aware that this is the idea you can generate electricity freely from the atmosphere. If you're not a tinfoil hat wearer, then maybe you want to get one now and put it on as we get into the conspiracy theory realms. His idea was, his ideology, his belief, NASA had this technology that he wanted to break into NASA, take the design patents for the technology and release it to the world so that nobody ever had to pay an energy bill, an electricity bill ever again. I mean, nowadays, of course, that sounds perhaps ideal. Perhaps, we should be hacking NASA more frequently, looking for this data. Now, he didn't find anything, obviously, but NASA alleged he did cause over $1 million of damage in the process. He did also leak numerous NASA documents in the process. So very disruptive for NASA in particular. The challenge with amateurs is they're highly unpredictable. Now, when we sort of learn a skill, we learn a particular tradecraft of some sort, we become sort of process-oriented, pattern-driven. As we get better at a certain activity, we tend to fall into a certain pattern of behavior. And the same is true with hackers. So, as they go through learn certain skills and sort of hone those skills over time, they become quite predictable. The challenge with amateurs is oftentimes they're highly unpredictable because they don't have this highly tuned skill set, and that can make them quite destructive, maybe sometimes themselves not really even realizing the extent of the damage that they're causing or may have caused. So we've got our amateur class of hackers. We come up to the sort of levels and think sort of capability and motivation. That's what we're talking about here. How capable is the hacker and what is their motivation? As we come up the sort of threat classes to the most sort of threatening of them, you'll see that they do take on an entirely different sort of persona. So lone criminals, mostly opportunistic. So they will do some directed or targeted activities, but again, it's mostly opportunistic, perhaps running some network scans, looking for particular weakness in a business, or running a sort of bulk phishing campaign, sending out lots and lots of spurious email to loads and loads of different people at once, but mostly opportunistic, often crime on crime funded. So they're sort of reinvesting, if you like, back into their business, the proceeds of the last hack itself, the last crime itself. And over time, of course, as their funds build up, that gives them access to more sophisticated tools, perhaps to buy from the darknet, for example, or buys more time for them to invest in developing, some software for themselves. We would consider lone criminals to be highly entrepreneurial and oftentimes are available for hire. So what we do see, certainly in our own forensics data, is certain characteristics that lend themselves to one particular sort of lone hacker, maybe not by actual name, by sort of code name of some sort or designator of some sort, who will work with various different criminal groups. So they're just a gun for hire, basically. Perhaps they've got a particular skill set, for example. Now, when we get into this class, ideology really does leave the room. This is all down to money, financially motivated 100% of the time. So if we look on the right-hand side, this is Christina Svechenskaya. She was a money mule. So she was a gun for hire. She was a money mule for other crime gangs. So gangs that were trying to clean up the proceeds of their crimes would hire Christina to clean up those funds for them. She is Russian by origin. She was studying at university in the US when she committed her crimes and ultimately spent time in prison, in jail. She would hack people's bank accounts. So she would hack into people's bank accounts and funnel through the proceeds of crime through those accounts into different accounts and clean it up basically over a period of time, ultimately paying it back to the individuals who she was cleaning it for. So she was a money mule. She was cleaning up dirty money for criminals by hacking people's bank accounts and passing those funds through those accounts, often in multiple different hops. And over the course of about sort of 18 to 24 months, she netted probably about $2 million in terms of her own upside for the hack themselves. And I think actually they're going to make a movie about Christina. Now, when you listen to her talk about why she got involved in it, I think this is really interesting. It sort of brings to life the human nature. You know, like, why did you get involved in hacking, Christina? Now, her answer to this was that her family, so she'd come to the US to study. While she was there, sadly, her father had passed away. There isn't a huge amount of social care in Russia, so it left her mother alone. She's an only child. So she got into hacking to help finance looking after her mum in Moscow, and used to send, you know, money home to pay for sort of rent and food and all that kind of stuff. When you think about it, that sort of hopefully brings to life some of the motivations, the human nature element of it. We come up a level again in terms of capability and motivation. And the real distinction from this point on is, instead of people working in isolation, they work in groups, in teams. Now, if you think about it in your own business, you know, teamwork makes the dream work, let's be honest. When we work together, we collaborate, we can achieve so much more in business. And the same is true, obviously, in the cybercrime business. The more skills we have, the more diversity, you know, the better prospect we have of being able to hack our way into somebody's business and monetize that particular activity. You look at hacktivists, often targeted. They're often looking for or to highlight particularly unethical practices. So if you consider some of the biggest hacktivist organizations today, some of which you may have heard of, Anonymous, so often targets and hacks government entities, particularly when they are in opposition to things like foreign policy or sanctions and stuff like that. So perhaps trying to exercise some sort of political angle. Greenpeace today is a hacktivist organization, is classed as a hacktivist organization, obviously looking more at the environmental side of ethics, particularly, you know, oil and gas, for example, climate change activists. Trident Plowshares, who are very sort of anti-nuclear and perform lots of hacktivist activity against businesses operating or supporting the nuclear industry. Very ideologically motivated as a group. They are funded. We call that donations. Some of the donations that we hear of are in the millions and come from sort of financiers. So, you know, there is a sort of, you know, when we say donation, we don't mean sort of, you know, someone shaking a pot on the street corner, or, you know, we're talking some fairly sizable donations and self-funded. A number of the sort of hacktivist groups are operated or led by sort of, you know, people who come from a sort of, you know, or have generated over the course of their career enough income to finance their own operation. Oftentimes, this group is purely interested in brand damage. So if you look at the likes of BP and the Gulf oil spill, naturally, sort of, you know, hacktivist organizations like Greenpeace actively interested, not just in the catastrophe, but perhaps some of the allegations that they made, finding evidence of allegations of cover-up and stuff like that, so that they can discredit that business, so that they can use the hack to bring to life the nature publicly of perhaps the, you know, how that business has been operating. Often working in large virtual groups, which makes them very difficult to disrupt. I spent time as a chief security officer in my career as well. Now, one of the sort of most, I suppose, I wouldn't call it embarrassing, but let's go with embarrassing. One of the most embarrassing hacks I ever had was 1,000 individuals organized themselves on social media as part of a well-known hacktivist body to all turn up to our business websites at the same time. 5 o'clock on a Friday, and all just keep hitting the refresh button on their browser. Now, the volume of traffic that generated into our network, we just weren't ready for, and it caused an outage. But this is hopefully bringing to life the nature of the large virtual group, because they work or operate in such large dispersed numbers. We're talking virtual teams working globally, coordinating their activities, perhaps over social media. They can be incredibly difficult to disrupt and can cause some fairly large scale problems, because they're ideologically motivated as well. There isn't really a negotiation opportunity with them. Now, this guy on the right-hand side of my screen, at least, Ruffin Oxblood, if you've never heard of Ruffin Oxblood, what a cool name, right? He looks like a total dude. He is a total dude. I think he's the chief operations officer for an hacktivist organization known as Cult of the Dead Cow. Now, if you've never heard of them, that is one website I would highly recommend you check out, just because it is cool. It is super, super cool. If you're into brand and marketing and stuff like that, it's a really cool website. So Cult of the Dead Cow, activist organization based out of Texas in the US. We come into the real problem area. Certainly the problem today is organized crime. I mean, lone hackers, lone criminals, yes, they are troublesome, they are problematic, but the nature of organized crime today is really where the nature of or the center of the problem sits. Now, this is mostly targeted campaigns, so it is going after a particular business. Perhaps again, they've run some sort of internet-wide scans, identified a load of businesses that have a particular weakness that they know how to exploit, and you just go on the list. So you end up on the list. It's like, a marketing list. Okay, well, we've tried X, let's try Y, let's try Z. It's really that sort of organized in that sense. Lots and lots of targeted campaigns, often crime funded in terms of syndicate funded. Cybercrime is just, think of it like a business division in a larger enterprise. So, we are talking about a business model, and it really is a business model. Cybercrime is a business model. It's then at this sort of organized level where you've perhaps got other business units, maybe some that deal with, physical extortion, or, perhaps some in violent crime, or people smuggling, or drug smuggling, or gun smuggling. And cybercrime then tends to form sort of one of the business units that's being funded by the proceeds of other crimes, oftentimes today entirely financially motivated. This is just about making cash. That really is it. We hear lots of speculation in the media about how perhaps some particular hacking groups or organized crime groups are affiliated with certain governments, for example. But the reality is they are just interested in making cash. They use very sophisticated techniques today, because as the bars come lower for entry into the market, tons and tons of lone hackers, the sort of amateur grade lone hackers have entered the market using what 10 years ago would have been very advanced techniques. And because that bar's lowered, access to more advanced techniques or more sophisticated tooling has become more commonplace as well. So as the bars come lower, naturally the sort of higher end of the spectrum has become more accessible as well. So often involved in other cyber crimes. Now, one of the big groups today is Evil Corporation. You sort of, if you're a Mr. Robot fan, you've probably come across this term before, but we're talking about, a real designated entity in this instance. And to make the sort of nature of cyber criminals a bit more sort of real, because, it's difficult there's very few today, sort of legal interventions. There's very few people actively getting caught. Now, here's one of them that we do know about. This is sort of a rare photo opportunity. He does look like he's perhaps posing for the cameras. This is Maxim Yakubet. He is a member of Evil Corporation. He came to sort of notoriety for a variant of ransomware, a particular type of malware that we'll talk about in a moment, known as Hades. And he's estimated to be worth about $100 million today. He's the guy on the right, if you haven't worked out from the picture. Now, he lives in St. Petersburg. Behind him is his custom paint job Lamborghini, estimated to be worth about $320,000, $330,000. He lives in this sort of luxury penthouse. He's really living the lifestyle. And you can see here, like, he's a known criminal operating with impunity. He stood there talking to a traffic officer, to a police officer, for example, just to give you a feel the nature of how organized crime maybe works. Maxim Jakobets, he is a notorious ringleader for the group Evil Corporation. Now, as eclectic a mix as this is, think Gary McKinnon, 50-year-old Glaswegian hacker, hacked NASA looking for sort of dark energy programs, all the way through to sort of Maxim Jakobets, who drives the world's worst paint job Lamborghini, but is estimated to be worth an extraordinary amount of money. What do they all have in common? Well, it all comes down to something known as the Dark Triad. It's criminal psychology. So we look at the center, the intent and motivation of the individual, and three properties or three characteristics about them. Now, narcissism gets a bad rap today, doesn't it? If we listen to sort of social media or pundits on YouTube, for example, everybody's got a downer on narcissism. Although actually, there's a good argument, a strong argument for a healthy degree of narcissism. Degree of self-belief is really what we're talking about. Think about it. If I don't have enough self-belief to be able to perform a certain activity or do my job, then I'm not going to be particularly good at it. I mean, I've got to believe that I'm capable of hacking into NASA to even give it a shot, right? If I was like sat in my bedroom, Gary McKinnon, Friday night, wouldn't dark energy, that'd be a lovely idea, but I'll never be able to get into NASA. We just won't worry about it. You've got to have a healthy degree of narcissism to be a hacker, to believe that you can actually hack in to a business. And I think sort of on a scale perhaps of 0 to 5. I mean, I'm not a big fan of scaling on this model, but we're not talking about being highly narcissistic as a hacker, but we're talking about having enough narcissism, enough belief in myself to actually bother to start this sort of hacking journey in the first place. Now, psychopathy, our remorselessness, really. We're talking about enough remorselessness to extort or blackmail you. So some way of extorting money out of you. But we're not talking about the level of psychopathy that would lend itself to violent crimes, for example. This is a different class of criminal. We're not talking about, the sorts of individuals that would perhaps people smuggle or gun smuggle or be involved in violent blackmail, or violent crimes, but definitely enough psychopathy to be able to perform a crime in the first place. You think about yourself, for example, there's loads of barriers to committing crimes and our own sort of guilt. The idea that we would have done something wrong is a really good, weather vane. Where hackers excel, so in all classes, is in what's known as Machiavellianism, our ability to manipulate somebody. Now, I always class the difference between manipulation and Machiavellianism as Machiavellianism is subtle, is undetectable, imperceptible to the recipient of it. How many times you've sort of maybe spoken to somebody, met somebody and thought to yourself, they're trying to influence me or they're trying to manipulate me in some way. That's us observing the characteristic in the party. The difference with Machiavellianism very much comes down to the imperceptible nature of it. Very, very subtle, very, very good at getting us to do things on their behalf. And hackers excel in the Machiavellian space. They really are excellent. And if you're familiar with terms like phishing and social engineering, most of the biggest and most successful hacks of all time have come down to high degrees of social engineering, where somebody has been duped into believing, the great con artists of this world, the sort of confidence tricksters. They're building a story or a narrative and selling it to a person without them actually realizing that it is a load of nonsense. So we're talking about the psychology at this point behind what does it take to really be a hacker. Now, if you're interested in this, definitely worth having maybe a look at yourself. Some of the research suggests in order to be a good CEO, you need to demonstrate the characteristics of the Dark Triad. Numerous well-named CEOs globally have had an assessment, and all of which have been found to be in this spectrum. So there is now a position being put forward in psychology that actually this isn't just about criminality. There is a sort of place for this perhaps in business. A fascinating branch of psychology. If you haven't heard of it or seen it before, definitely have a look at it. There's loads of information available online. Okay, what's referred to as TTPs in the hacking community, in the sort of cyber world: tactics, techniques, and procedures. The how. How do we do it? How are they doing it? Now, today, vulnerability scanners and exploit kits are the leading cause of all of our claims, all of them. So about 67% of all of our claims fall into the cause is the client was hit with a vulnerability scanner. So a scanner just runs through the internet looking for known vulnerabilities in software, isolates a device or a network that has that vulnerability present, has an exploit available, all prepackaged, ready to go. It's automated, hits the exploit on the vulnerability, and they're in to your business. It really is as automated as I've just made it sound, unfortunately. So vulnerability scanners and exploit kits, highly popular today. Obviously, keeping our software patched, having sort of endpoint detection response, anti-malware, antivirus style controls is a huge barrier to the success of that particular TTP. However, today it is very, very difficult to maintain sort of currency in our patch levels in our software, for example. Now, it is second only to the number 2 TTP, social engineering, still is very much in use today, particularly a technique we call spear phishing. So if you're familiar with the term phishing, this is, I send you a spoofed email impersonating somebody, or it's from Apple or DHL or someone like that. We're trying to get the reader to click on the link, usually using some sort of time pressure or incentive. As they click on their link, they connect to something remotely and it downloads some malware onto their device. In simple terms, that's really what we're looking at. Now, spear phishing, very much clickbaiting an individual. Now, think about how much information most of us put out online every single day. Like, who I am, where I work, what I'm interested in, who I hang out with, where I go, you name it. So today, actually, gathering a tiny little bit of intelligence about the person we want to click on our link is proving to be very successful. I realize that you live, I don't know, in Canterbury, and you live at this particular place, you work at this particular company that I know I've got a vulnerability in. So what I could do, look for something that you're interested in. Maybe I see loads of photos of you sort of eating out. So I clickbait you with, there's a new restaurant in Canterbury and here's 20% off. Join us for our opening night on Friday. Oh yeah, that's not you've got a parcel from DHL, I haven't ordered anything kind of email. This is highly targeted, but using very, very small amounts of information that are very widely available on the internet. And then we come down into the sort of, the sort of edge cases, I would call them. Remote access Trojans, piece of malicious software gets dropped into your network. It then creates a remote connection, dials home to another device, and it creates remote control, basically, so they can remotely control your device. We do see that quite frequently, but nowhere near as frequently as the top 2. Credential theft, stealing usernames and passwords, multi-factor authentication or 2-factor authentication. We had hoped, and for a number of years, was a very effective style of control, excuse me, against hacking. But today, badly, hackers have worked out how to circumvent this particular control, a technique known as saturation. So they keep pinging you with an MFA request. Maybe it comes to your token to your phone on an SMS, or a token on an app, for example. Maybe it's just an approve. Yeah, I approve the request. So, maybe perhaps you get 20 or 30 of them. Keep hitting no, keep hitting no, you've hit yes. And that just one time has allowed the hacker in. That's become a particularly effective method. We're seeing that grow in use at the moment. Turning up on malicious websites, you go to a website, it looks legit, but it ends up pulling something down onto your device, or spyware, typically sort of keyloggers trying to harvest up sensitive data like credentials. But today, those 2 account for, the top 2 account for, over 90% of what we see in terms of initial intrusion. How the hacker got in: vulnerability scanner with an exploit kit, or social engineering, which has led to, a user being spearphished, essentially clickbaited. And we see some very, very sophisticated clickbaiting, like I've just described, with restaurants or gyms, stuff that appeals to that person, that particular individual. You can tell they've been profiled. Conscious of time, I told you I can talk about cyber literally forever. So the most common types of cybercrime we see today, so identity fraud or impersonation. Naturally, I mean, identity fraud has been a crime for a number of years in the real world and also digital worlds. We still see a fair degree of that today, particularly with sort of small to medium businesses. We do have a disproportionately high volume of payment diversion fraud. This is invoice fraud, basically wire fraud. So where we're seeing bank account details be modified in invoicing, for example, payments being made out to the wrong addresses, stuff like that. That is disproportionately high. When we look over all of our class of business, small to medium, do tend to see a sort of disproportionately high level of payment diversion fraud. Denial of service attack tends to hit bigger businesses or those who are dependent on their web presence to generate revenue. That could be, retail, online retail, for example, but we see that as a means of extortion. Blackmail and extortion today, so data theft, stealing your data, then holding you, sort of extorting you on its return. That's very common. And ransomware, of course, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. You can't read the news today without hearing about it. We're going to talk about that a lot more in this session today. There are over 1,000 variants of ransomware doing the rounds, so it really is big business, and it is the number one problem that we face. We see all of the other crimes all the time, but ransomware itself, look at our own experience across the globe, 60,000 different clients in most countries, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere. 52% of all of our claims, so over half, are ransomware related. The other 48% relate to everything else. So you can see it is a problem. 99% of all large losses, and we class that as a loss over $1 million, is due to ransomware. So as you then look at what we would look at, two characteristics in insurance. We would look at the frequency and severity. If you look at the first statistic, it gives you the frequency. How frequent is this attack? It's the most frequent form of attack. Not only that, but it does have and carries with it the greatest severity, so the greatest impact. It is 99% of all of our claims over $1 million are all linked to ransomware. And today is sort of evolving format of extortion, which I will talk about. Now, if you're not familiar with ransomware, you're missing out. It's all the rage. Definitely get involved where you can. Obviously, I'm kidding. Please don't get involved in cybercrime. But the ransomware business model specifically. So ransomware is a type of malicious software known as malware. It's just a portmanteau. It's malicious software merged together from a family known as cryptovirology. And what it does is it threatens to perpetually block access to data unless a ransom is paid. And it achieves this by using encryption. Now you think we encrypt data to keep it safe, to stop prying eyes, for privacy reasons, for example. Now, when somebody encrypts our data for us, and then they keep the secret decryption key to themselves, we then can't access our data. It's just jumbled up letters and numbers, gobbledygook. Now, today, and I worked in cryptanalytics, first sort of part of my career many, many years ago. It is possible, theoretically possible, but it is possible to decrypt a message without knowing the key. But we refer to that as an intractable problem. You could do it, but it might take you 2 years. Will your business still be here in 2 years, 3 years? If it takes you 6 months to decrypt all of your data without knowing the key, that's not a sort of a solid solution to the problem, really. So the extortion demand kicks in then, and the victim is forced to pay or never retrieve their data. And you think for some businesses that really is, sink or swim in terms of a moment in time. Now, just to paint that picture, make it a bit memorable for you, nice easy way to remember it. So I just have to pay you half a Bitcoin to unlock my computer. I mean, this is what we're talking about. The extortion demand, you will pay in Bitcoins or cryptocurrency of some sort. They'll give you a decryption key, and then you can decrypt your data and get back to business. Now, if we look at the evolution of it over time, there's loads of different sort of arguments for why ransomware in particular has gone through the roof in terms of particularly frequency, but also increasingly over time severity. But ransomware is not new at all. It's been around since sort of 1989. The first version, known as the AIDS virus, which was circulated on floppy disks at an AIDS and HIV conference. Actually, the extortion demand. So when you plugged it into your machine, the floppy disk into your machine, it would then sort of lock you out of your data, and you'd have to send like a postal order to a PO box somewhere in the Caribbean. Not the most effective of scams, but it did work. What really drove the sort of, uptick in ransomware is the emergence of cryptocurrencies, the ability to get paid anonymously and digitally. I mean, that was just a huge catalyst for ransomware. And you look at the period sort of from cryptocurrencies emerging around 2009 through to sort of mainstream into sort of 2015, the surge at that point is enormous. And then we have this steady state just growth over time as it becomes highly commoditized, easy to perform. Various different names on that slide, like Locky and Mamba or WannaCry, names you may or may not have heard of. As we come sort of towards the end of the spectrum there, towards 2022, we start to see this sort of frequency and severity paralleling off. So, and actually what we're seeing right now in our latest claims data is a slight decline in both the severity and the frequency, which is about the best news we could possibly hope for. But there's, it's very early days for us to be calling that a trend. What is important on this slide, so around 2019, loads of businesses had learned to sort of combat the threat of ransomware. We'd been dealing with it for quite a while, having data backups and storing some offline and using a good endpoint detection response or antivirus technology on your endpoints, for example, all very effective means for blocking ransomware, really. So what's happened is it's over the period since 2019, data theft, data exfiltration has become the primary means of extortion in a ransomware attack. So 2019, groups started encrypting your data and stealing a load of it before encrypting your system so that they could sort of have a fallback plan, basically. Now, over the period since 2019, what we've seen is that most of our clients are being extorted on the data theft element. Lots of them can recover their systems perfectly fine from a backup, or perhaps they block the ransomware element itself, but they've had highly sensitive data stolen. And then the extortion demand is, if you don't pay us X, we will release this data publicly. Now, oftentimes that makes people think about the theft of personal data. Oh, they're coming in and stealing large volumes of personal data. Personal data doesn't have a hugely extortable value. It does depend on your business, but it's not hugely extortable. What they find is hugely extortable, and what we see in our forensics evidence is they immediately are going for intellectual property or commercial contracts, financial accounting, anything in the sort of ethics space. Mailboxes tend to get targeted quite heavily, particularly sort of CEOs, CFOs, etc. They're looking for something that they can blackmail you with. It could be ethics related, it could be bonuses related. We've seen that one, pay awards, all sorts of intellectual property naturally is one of, commercial contracts, loads and loads of different sensitive data, but not personal data. I mean, some businesses that is still extortable. If your client base, for example, is nationally sensitive, or celebrities, people like that, then you do have some extortable angle to the PII. But if it's my data in a database, or even my payment data, it's of little value extortably today for a cyber criminal. Now, ransomware, I joke, I say personally, I blame Julius Caesar. If you didn't know, Julius Caesar is the sort of grandfather of cryptography. He's sort of credited with developing cryptography, encryption methods. He is also the first ever recorded person to be held to ransom. Now, if you think about how ransomware works, it is an encryption algorithm that locks you out of your data and you're held to ransom. So Julius Caesar, first person to be held to ransom, and considered to be the founding father of cryptography. The third reason I blame him is he's not here to defend himself. The biggest players today, Lockbit 3 as a ransomware operator, next generation ransomware platform. It is a platform as a service, ransomware as a service. Think cloud services. So cybercrime has moved into cloud services. Maybe you want to buy a bit of theft or a bit of paths, or this is, you turn up, you've got enough cash to hire the platform, doesn't matter who you are, and it really is sort of console driven, a graphical interface. Who do you want to extort? Well, this person. How much do you want to ask for? This much. It really, really is a very, very simplified process, and there's a team of people that sit behind it, running and managing the ransomware platform itself. And they have what's known as affiliates who buy access to the platform. I talked at the start, look at the Wikipedia definition. You've got to be a skilled computer expert. I really do disagree with that. You've got to have $25,000 to hire the Lockbit platform. Definitely, it's, barrier to entry at that point is price. But outside of that, there isn't really a barrier. And once you're in, it's very easy because all the hard technical stuff is being dealt with by the people that run the platform itself. Because it's used by various different organizations, various different people, the tactics vary wildly, which makes it very, very difficult for us to sort of isolate and detect the sort of pattern of behavior of Lockbit so that we can block it. They average, to give you a feel for sort of victim rates, they average about 10 victims per day. They are the market leader by an enormous share. We come down to the sort of next largest player in the market. You're looking at about 4 victims per day globally. So Lockbit really is a major player. So last summer, you had to be a Russian speaker to access the platform. You had to provide references. You had to have the cash at bank, $25,000 to gain entry. Last year, after sort of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, the platform restrictions were lifted. So you no longer need to be a Russian speaker. And what we've seen since then is the spread of Lockbit into Southern Hemisphere countries as a consequence, because now you can be Spanish speaking, Portuguese speaking, Mandarin speaking, there's no restrictions anymore, whereas previously they've been locked down to Russian speakers only. I just make it clear, not Russian speakers, and obviously lots of different nationalities do speak the Russian language. Lockbit has one of the most efficient data exfiltration tools in the business. It really is slick, it's automated, it compresses data to reduce the amount of space on the network required to get large volumes of data out. It's fast, really, really fast, terrifyingly fast, actually, in terms of how much data it can exfiltrate in a very, very short period of time. Few downsides, things to know about Lockbit. They are known to pay insiders for access, social engineering. We talked about sort of the Machiavellian traits. That could just be, getting somebody to do something with cash. I'll pay you to do it. Oh, I don't know about that. I'll go on, you want to, they encourage the party into it. They are, and this is a problem for us as insurers, because we use negotiators to sort of help our clients work through the extortion process itself. They are known to backhand the negotiators. If you get the price at 50,000, we'll give you 20%, something like that. So backhanding the negotiator themselves, problematic. They're also known for hoaxes and deception. So, perhaps they got into your device or into your network. They ran their data exfiltration tool known as StealBit, but it didn't work properly for some reason. They'll still tell you that they've stolen all of your data. They'll maybe give you a screenshot of something to show that they've got all of your data. But in reality, it's just a hoax. It's failed to execute, for example. So very, very advanced actor. And it's all just commodity stuff. Now, so they're mainstream today, major player. Look at the other end of the spectrum, sort of Gartner quadrant style, the sort of emergers, the sort of movers and shakers in the market. Alpha or Blackcat is the one that we've got our eye on at the moment. This group is a similar style to Lockbit. It's ransomware as a service, but you can only get into it if you're in the sort of circle of trust, basically. The idea being that it sort of narrows down the opportunity for law enforcement to infiltrate the network. This group massively favors vulnerability exploitation, so scan a network, look for a particular vulnerability, and they're coming through that. Oftentimes, that is also in security technologies themselves. Might be a VPN solution, might be an EDR solution, for example. They do use email-based attacks, so compromising email addresses, what we refer to as BEC, business email compromise. They do that quite a lot. They're also highly efficient data exfiltrators. They're very professional extortion negotiators. When we talk to our sort of debrief our response partners and our negotiators, are like, these guys are pros when it comes to negotiating. Like, they're down to sort of, so one of our sort of our negotiators is ex-police, and he said it's like talking to a police negotiator sometimes. It's like they know exactly where you're going and what you're doing, and They're very, very good at sort of negotiating price, for example. They're also very good crime scene cleaners, which has made it very difficult for us to isolate any particular sort of forensics evidence that would help us perhaps to sort of start slowing down the effectiveness of this. And, we suspect some Russian connections, although, that is a very tenuous position at the moment. I think that's the default position usually for hackers. Just want to sort of bring this to life a little bit in terms of timeline. So this is a case we dealt with September last year, small to medium business. Hacker had been researching some targets, crafted some clickbait, all of which happened sort of before the timeline starts. When we look at how the attack initiated, to draw it back to the actual point in time at which it started, 1804, so 4 minutes past 6 in the evening, a Trojan is delivered, a piece of malware is delivered into somebody's mailbox. That's executed, is clicked on, creates a connection back to a malicious device on the internet. That's then used to download loads more commodity malware into the client's network itself. Between sort of 1930, so 7:30 and 8:45, loads of unpatched software gets exploited. You look through to the timeline and the total sum of time that was taken during this attack. We go from sort of the attack starting at 6 o'clock in the evening and everything being encrypted before 10:30. I mean, that is a very, very rapid turnaround, but we're seeing that become increasingly the trend. I want to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. I don't have to rush off until sort of 3:30, so I'm very happy if there are questions to field some after time anyway. But just to give you a feel for some of the claims trends that we're seeing and sort of we emphasize some of the problems. Ransomware does remain the leading cause of all large losses, everything over $1 million, but severity and frequency are starting to decline with the sort of traditional encrypting ransomware moving into the Southern Hemisphere today. And we're seeing the next evolution. Data exfiltration is my message to you today in terms of, what is the real threat we're facing? People coming in and stealing commercially sensitive or intellectual property data that is extortable has now become the primary means of extortion because PII is just not as lucrative. Personal data, PII is just not as lucrative as it once was. There are all these new generation of closed group ransomware platforms emerging, like Alpha Blackcat, which is, of course, a new market space. It's a trusted community cloud services, really, is what it is. Our claims data shows us most of our ransomware attacks or data extortion today happen between December and March. So they are the most active periods in every territory, every year, over year. So for the last 5 years, May and September do also spike. There is a steady state, of course. So we do see a steady state, but there are certain times of the year where it really is obviously spiking. UK, the good news in all of this is, UK has the lowest frequency of all of the territories that we work in. So the US is particularly bad. The EU is growing in its numbers, but the UK has always been fairly stable. We have a fairly sort of stable level of claims in the UK, and it's the lowest of all the territories that we work in. There's a few things on here, and you can take a sort of a glance through the slide yourself. But some of the challenges our clients are facing, not knowing where their data actually is and if it's being accessed. I mean, is it in a cloud service? Is it on a device? What data is being stored where? That really is a problem when it comes to people stealing your data and making an extortion demand. If you don't know where your data was, you could easily get hoaxed into it as much as anything else. So knowing where your data is really important. The speed of attack, that use case just highlights how fast hackers can move through your network or through a system at this point in time, highly automated. Not knowing where stuff is really is a common problem. Not having any vulnerability data, so not keeping up with patches, having vulnerabilities in your software. And that bottom one really for me, just not being confident really with how to deal in the event of a crisis like ransomware. Haven't had the opportunity to think about it, talk about it with colleagues or other members of your business, decision makers who are going to be required, to at some point, if this happens, asked, do you want to pay? Do you want to pay the extortion demand? That's not an easy, when you think about crime, the proceeds of crime, that's not an easy conversation to have or an easy answer to come up with. So having had it in advance will definitely help deal with the crisis quickly and confidently. And the quicker you deal with a crisis, the less chaos there is, basically, the less mess there is to tidy up. So being able to manage the crisis quickly and confidently. There we go, whirlwind tour. Hopefully you sort of learned something in there that you didn't know perhaps yesterday. I'm very happy to stay on and field any calls you might have. I don't have, my next engagement's not till 15:30, although I do need to walk there. So sort of 15, I can stay for 15 or 20 minutes. Sonia, may I hand back to you? And should anyone have any questions, please do raise them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll share the recording with everyone anyway, but if anyone has any questions, the webinar will stop recording in a couple of minutes, but absolutely, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat or take themselves off mute. Let's just see if there's any questions incoming. Roberta.
Guys, thank you very much for that. We've experienced as a company a hack via Meta 3 months ago. Now, I think personally, all the research I've done on it and speaking to a lot of other companies, we were part of a wide Meta breach that took place in February. Meta won't answer anything from us. I'm also PR by trade, so I've tried all the PRs. They talk to me until they find out I think it was a hack at their end. I've spoken to the Metro newspaper. They have spoken to Meta because a lot of companies found themselves in this situation. We lost access to our business Meta account overnight. We've never managed to get it back since, and it's taken us pretty much down our D2C business. I have some insurance, but it doesn't cover a breach that isn't our breach. This sort of thing is becoming increasingly common, and the big companies couldn't care less. We're nothing to them, but obviously it's very damaging for our businesses. What is available to us in terms of how we protect ourselves from that? Because when the company is breached that is looking after you, won't admit it or won't deal with you, I don't really know what companies are supposed to do in that circumstance.
There's a very difficult situation to be in. I'm very sorry to hear the challenges you've had. I mean, this is Facebook are notorious for it. I mean, I won't slate them. I'm not their biggest fan by any stretch, but all of the major breaches Facebook have had or Meta have had, in the current guise, you'll find out 12 months from now when the sort of, when they're able to smooth over the reputational damage, basically. There are some good arguments in the security community about why you wouldn't declare it early as well, because you might not actually have the situation under control. So, I'm sort of playing devil's advocate. There's perhaps a good reason why they don't want to sort of announce or declare, but equally, like you say, there are people relying on that service. And hopefully some clarity in terms of when it might be available, or the impact of the compromise. But I suspect what you'll find, end of this year, start of next year, Facebook or Meta will go public with the nature of what's happened, and no one will care by then, because enough times under the bridge. The sort of what can you do about it? I mean, in security we talk about sort of single points of failure, and building resilience into our business is all about not having sort of sole dependencies, particularly in our sort of supply chain or vendor, in our vendor food chain. So looking at sort of how you could build resilience or design out of your business model, single points of failure or high dependencies on third-party systems. I mean, it's challenging, depending on your business model, and obviously certain social media platforms, for example, or advertising channels, obviously attract and have certain benefits. So perhaps that's not an option for you, but usually resilience at that point would be suggested that you reduce the dependency on one entity by moving some of what you do into other vendor spaces. And that way, if one is compromised, it's the old adage of all your eggs in one basket, basically. If you do everything through one platform and it's breached, then it's going to have a much broader impact than if you've got that dispersed over multiple channels, which is a planning exercise, really, and mightn't even be a choice for you. That might, from a risk management point of view just be something you have to accept. Perhaps there isn't a huge amount that you can really do about
yeah,
it.
no, I mean, we've totally learned that lesson. But when you're an e-commerce platform, wiping out the biggest platform to advertise on in the world is somewhat of a challenge. And also the problem is it's not as simple as starting another Meta account, because
right.
Meta are saying that someone else has our domain. Yeah. We have our domain, but we can't, everything is attached to it. So and like I say, that didn't, my question really also was, what sort of insurance, because I haven't found any, and I have my current insurers say if the hack isn't, or the breach isn't at our end, there is no protection against it.
It does vary massively by product.
Right.
So I'm not an underwriter, and I won't give sort of any financial advice, but but I do know insurance products, as you might expect, reasonably well. They do vary by vendor, so by who you get your insurance from. Third party coverage at that point is what you'd be looking for. So if somebody in your supply chain is offline, that the business interruption it causes is covered by the policy, you'd be looking for sort of third party coverage at that point. Loads of cyber insurance policies do include it. Naturally, the more coverage you apply, the more expensive the policy gets.
Of course.
You know, absolutely. It's the difference between, you know, third party fire and theft, or fully comprehensive insurance. Really, the more you add, the more benefits you get. Obviously, the more risk exposure the insurer is carrying, therefore the more cost they have to charge for the product overall. So, but there are certainly products that do cover that particular type of event.
Well, we'll look at that. I hadn't managed to find one yet. Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Pleasure. Anyone else?
Any other questions from anyone else? Doesn't seem so. All right. Well then, thank you so much, Adi. There was a lot of very useful information. And I'll share the recording with everyone later today or tomorrow latest. Thank you so much, everyone.
Pleasure. Thanks so much. Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.